And a happy Tuesday evening, Bills Mafia, football fans, haters of football, people who enjoy watching people talk on bright screens. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of Under Review. My name is Joe DeRosa. You can find me on Twitter /X at show_DeRosa. And my dear friends, as I mentioned last week, we have traversed through the weeds of the offseason. We are past the doldrums and now on to bigger, brighter horizons as football officially, at least in my opinion, because I know it's a new league year, has started with training camp underway just in, I was about to say 24 hours, but that's not true. Oh, well, it's coming soon. And I am very excited. And if you couldn't already tell, my tagline tonight is Joge Mathis, because I borrowed one of the co-hosts from the Air Raid Hour, Mr. David Tilton. And the two of us are going to be giving you our training camp storylines to watch, the players that we are excited to see, the positional battles that we can expect to see really fleshed out pretty early in camp, and a bunch of other things that I hope you're excited to see. So once again, everybody, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to kick this discussion off. So let's go.
Previous play will go under review.
And once again, everybody, thank you so much for being here. As you got to witness me completely flatline during the intro of this episode, I completely, sometimes my brain just stops working when I don't want it to stop working. And in that moment, you witnessed me completely stop before I got what I wanted to say out. So my apologies for that. But thank you guys all so much for being here. And David, welcome back to the show. It's been quite some time. I'm really happy to have you here for this discussion. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing well, Joe, and I just want to thank you again. I know you've been trying to get me on, and I've had issues getting back on, but I've been really wanting to get back on your show. I really love your show. I think you do a great job in preparation. I think you do a great job in having an open mind on a lot of things, and it's not easy to do this solo. And so, as you can see, I adjusted my tagline tonight to be the pride of Dutchess County, New York, as we've had our chats about the Poughkeepsie area in the past and how you've lived there. And so, it's going to be fun tonight, and it's kind of nice. I love being guests on people's shows because, for one, I see it as a privilege to go on someone else's show. They want me to come on. And so, yeah, man, thanks so much for having me on. And I'm glad we could make it work this time around.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. I appreciate your kind words. Again, I'm relatively new to the space compared to everyone else in the network. So it always means a lot when any one of you guys just has anything nice to say, because, I'm hard on myself. I think I'm an idiot. But no, I appreciate you being here, man. And also, for those of you guys don't know, David and I are from the same, at least for a time in our lives, the same area. And we have to represent the 845 on the show whenever we can. There's not many of us. Well, we're literally the only two in the Cover One chat that have any affiliation with that area. But the fact that you wanted to represent it tonight is truly exceptional. And so will too this conversation. I am excited to talk to you about training camp, have everything being kicking off tomorrow with, now we have our veterans reporting, everyone's moving into St. John's. And it's just an exciting time, especially with the really big lull in the news cycle in the football world, especially in the Bills world, that we're finally going to get to just see everything going on in practice, everything that we can, have been speculating about for so long. So let's get right to it. And before we get into the deep positional battles, I just want to ask you first, just how are you feeling about training camp? Really, your overall vibe about the team going into this season?
Well, I will say this. So last night, Judge and I did the Air Raid Hour. I had not watched the latest Embedded yet before we did our show. It came out like an hour before our show aired last night. So I got to watch it today. And man, I put a tweet out today, and I'm the vibes of the coordinators to me is at an all-time high. There wasn't a ton of Sean McDermott in that Embedded, right? It was a pretty big focus on Joe Brady coming into kind of his first full true season as starting as the offensive coordinator for this team. And Bobby Babich, man, I'm really impressed with the way he came across. And I know
Yeah.
these things are super edited. I get that. They're there to make the Bills look as good as possible, but it's hard to ignore the positive energy that both of those guys appear to have been bringing or are bringing to their respective sides of the ball. And I really hope Bobby Babich gets a chance to call the defensive plays this year. I think that he just has this aura about him, this it factor, I feel like, and I could be way off, right? But he just seems like he's got something where he's on a trajectory to do something special in the NFL with this team and then maybe even beyond down the road. And I know I'm getting my head ahead of myself, but for me, the vibes going into training camp are high. This is a new iteration of this Bills team with some obviously still some of the key players of Josh Allen and others still around, but this is a new version of the Bills team. And I do appreciate that Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott are going into the season with a slightly different approach. Both the coordinators are new, new faces on the roster at key areas, receiver, safety. And so I do appreciate that they are trying something new to get over the hump in the postseason because that's ultimately the goal of this team.
For sure. And when they made the pivot to their coordinators, and I'd said it a few times, during the summer, it was very refreshing to see that they kind of made the moves that you were just hoping they'd make, but also pivot to a younger group of coordinators as well. And with
Yes.
Babbage and Brady, you have two younger guys with, I would say, it's not to discredit the merit or the experience of past coaches, but younger guys often tend to trend to more of the modern trends in the league. You get to see them implement fresh new ideas. And I think with these coordinators, that's something that I'm quite excited to see if that pans out when we get to camp and beyond. And that embedded episode, yes, it is Bills propaganda for sure. Absolutely. It is a smile, feel good campaign, but you get a lot of questions when you bring in a lot of new coordinators or a lot of new faces, new coaches, especially these two who are manning a position that you've seen uncertainty with in the past few years with the departure of Frazier. McDermott takes over at DC, and now they're pointing him at that role. And then you look at Joe Brady, who's filling in for, well, even though it was half season last year, Ken Dorsey, and a lot of skepticism and criticism that generally goes to that position because obviously any stalled drive will lead to that. So to have them kind of spotlight these two guys and just show their energy, show their passion, show how they're communicating with the players, to me is just always a welcome thing. And it makes me really excited, and I think was the perfect way to cap off the end of the offseason as we pivot into training camp and get our minds on the season ahead. And we'll get further into this discussion, but I just want to pull up this comment real fast. RJ, thank you so much. This intro video, I actually changed it a couple months ago. So I very much appreciate the compliment and appreciate that you noticed it. It is new in the scope of the past few months. So I am glad that you finally caught it. And I'm glad that anyone who has gotten to see this over the past few weeks, thank you very much for your compliments. So, David, let us go into the discussion now. And we're going to start on offense. And I want to start with really one of the most spoken about positional battles in the wide receiver room. And we know that the top end of this room is very likely going to feature a mix of Keon Coleman, Khalil Shakir, Curtis Samuel, and then the waters tend to murk up a little bit when you get towards the back end, especially that potential wide receiver 5 or 6, depending on how many they want to keep, with guys like Chase Claypool, MVS, Mac Hollins, and then some of the other sneaky contenders like KJ Hamler, Tyrell Shavers, Justin Shorter. So talk to me first about this room and this positional battle in camp. I mean, just what you're expecting to see, and honestly, how many receivers you might think they walk away with when camp is done.
I will say this, and Judge and I did our sort of pre-camp 53-man projections, and I think honestly, Mac Hollins is locked into a roster spot already. He seems like the guy that's going to kind of come in and replace Gabe Davis from a run blocking standpoint, having that size. I think he's got offensive chops that he's shown flashes of in the past with pretty subpar quarterback play. And I'm not saying Mac Hollins is going to be a huge contributor, but I do think like him along with the other three guys, those guys seem like pretty well entrenched. I also think MVS is pretty well entrenched in my mind to a roster spot, given he brings a skill set that the Bills don't really have on the team, that deep threat. Played well in the playoffs, obviously for Kansas City last year, and the Bills needs a guy that can be a field stretcher. They really haven't had that. Like Gabe Davis did some of that, but he wasn't really that field stretching guy. He did it at times, but the Bills really haven't had that in the offense So to me, this comes down to the 6th wide receiver spot, a competition between guys like Chase Claypool, KJ Hamler, Andy Isabella, Justin Shorter, Tyrell Shavers. I think all of those guys are competing for one spot. And when you think about, because I will say, I would be surprised if the Bills do keep 7 wide receivers. I just think that there's too many other, when you start going down and trying to make a 53-man roster, it's just really hard to keep 7 wide receivers with the rest of the positional groups that you have to fill. So I'll say that my money would be that they keep 6, and it's going to come down to 4 or 5, 6 guys competing maybe for one spot. Unless MVS really just like blows it in camp. But I think based on the contract they gave him, he's pretty much entrenched. How early they signed Mac Hollins, I think he's entrenched. So for my money right now, I'm looking at a guy who's going to contribute on special teams. The Bills have lost some special teamers in the offseason. Is that going to be a guy like Tyrell Shavers, who in college was maybe the best gunner in college football his last season? That 6th wide receiver, you don't need to have a huge expectation of contribution on offense for that person. So I will be very curious to see how much the Bills value maybe a guy who's a little bit more skilled offensively versus a guy who maybe is a better special teamer for that 6th wide receiver spot. And I think they would lean towards the guy that's the better special teamer. So I think Chase Claypool has an uphill battle, to be honest, to make the team. And it wouldn't surprise me if a guy like Tyrell Shavers kind of came out of that group, given his special team prowess, to make the team. I'm not saying he will, but I would say don't be surprised if that 6 wide receiver spot comes down to a guy who's really good on special teams.
Yeah. So I first agree that I do think it's going to be 6 players total. I think that when you talk about how I would arrange the room just for the 5, it's like I said before, it's going to be a mix of Coleman, Curtis Samuel, Khalil Shakir, Mac Hollins, and MVS. And I think with the money that MVS got this late in the game, I think even though it's not an astronomical amount, it is significant enough for me to be convinced that they're going to hold on to him. And like you alluded to, the skill set isn't really that common in this Bills wide receiver room right now. They wanted a vertical speedster. And in addition to being a speedster, he's got the size and is a good blocker. And I think with the way that this offense seems to be pivoting stylistically, blocking is a huge proponent of your ability to stay on this roster and make yourself known and get meaningful snaps. And with MVS's ability to do both, I don't think there's really a shot he's gone unless there is just a brutal camp. And he's a savvy NFL vet. I don't think a brutal camp is in his future. It would take something pretty significant for me to say he wouldn't make this roster. So those are your 5. And then when you look at the 6, because I agree it'll be 6, to me, it's been the constant conversation of what do the Buffalo Bills value the most? And then you have to look at the profiles of all these receivers and then compare them to each other. Who is the best special teamer, as you alluded to, but also who blocks the best? Who provides you with that combination of blocking ability and maybe some field play that is dynamic enough to warrant getting that final spot? Or do they value speed and the ability to be something of a pawn where maybe the 6 wide receiver is a useful skill set for disguising things offensively, running a few more motion packages, being a threat in play action if you want to threaten in that way as well, which is why there's merit to say that the opportunity for maybe a KJ Hamler or an Andy Isabella isn't far-fetched or I should say it isn't far-fetched for these guys to make the roster. But given what we know about this coaching staff in the past, I would say that it's probably going to be the special teams route, just because, again, you can never have too many people. They lost some key contributors on special teams as well. And even though you have some guys that have come in through free agency in the draft that have been proven special teamers, you still want to fortify that room as much as possible, especially in a year where that rule changes and the implications of good special teams play has now become larger than it has in years past, in my opinion. So for that reason, I am in agreement with you that I think that would probably be the overall deciding factor, the straw that breaks the camel's back. And as far as who I would realistically think takes it, I think Claypool has a shot.
He does.
I think
they all do. They all do. I mean, you can ask 5 different people, you get 5 different answers who they want the wide receiver to be. So.
And I ran a Twitter poll, or not a Twitter poll, but I tweeted about this, and I'll share it a little later in the show, and I won't forget this time. Hold me accountable, David, because I did that once and forgot, and I felt so bad because I'm like, oh, thanks for all these responses, guys. Oops. But I got a plethora of different responses, and a lot of people's fifth or sixth man, because some people thought only five receivers, were a healthy mix of different players. It's just really depending on what this coaching staff feels is the most valuable for that final spot, which is an obvious answer, but one that I think will be able to quell a lot of like questioning or suspense people may have when it comes to if they happen to choose a surprising option. Like, I think Hamler would be a surprising option, but I would like it and see the vision for it. Tyrell Shavers is a very interesting one, and I think that's a bit of a dark horse option, even though it shouldn't be, but it's seen that way. And then, of course, Justin Shorter is the interesting man on this list to me because they draft him in the 5th round last year. He gets hurt last year, so he goes on the IR, and you don't really get a showcase of what he can really do outside of some up and down moments in training camp and a preseason touchdown. So does he have any good graces with this coaching staff to have an opportunity to stay on this roster? Do they like his skill set? And that really is remaining to be seen. So in this battle, in this training camp, I'm really excited. And it's kind of funny saying this because it's a team that like, you know, when you are competitive, you're rooting for death battles, but like wide receiver 6 is going to be a lot of fun to watch. And I'm very interested to see who locks it down. But David, I'll ask you any other, comments, thoughts, anything you think is an underrated storyline about this wide receiver room before we carry on to the next positional group?
Well, I think there's a bit of a misperception out there that Hamler and Isabella are these like return mavens, and they're really not. I mean, you look at their career history, punt return, kick return, they don't have a ton of experience in doing that, even though I think a lot of Bills fans probably look at them and think, oh, well, maybe they can be on the team as a returner, and they're really not, and they haven't been. I'm not saying that they couldn't be, but they really haven't been, and that's why I don't think that necessarily gives guys like Hamler and Isabella necessarily a leg up. Shorter's an interesting one. They spent the draft pick on him last year. I always, think if you're Brandon Beane, you try to protect draft picks, especially after you've seen guys get swiped off your cut down days and swiped off your practice squad. So it'll be interesting. I genuinely think that last spot's going to be like 4, 5, 6 guys competing for one spot on the team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would be. I don't. And, that's the interesting thing to me when it comes to how this team is going to game plan every week, because I feel like the fluctuation of how often they're bringing someone up from the practice squad to fill a certain need in the back end of the room might change just week to week based on matchup, which more so in the past, considering how embryonic I expect Joe Brady's offense to really be, how game plan dependent I expect it to be. And for that reason, I think it is very likely that even if you have 6, it would be 5, but maybe you have someone promoted, or maybe there's 2 guys stashed on the squad that you can rotate throughout the year. And again, like in your transactions, if you happen to lose one of these guys and you need to get someone new, like how often is that going to happen? But yeah, I think 6 is really just what I would see as the most likely option. I think that's really what it's a reasonable amount. And I don't think that it's as likely that the impending returner, at least the primary one in my eyes, is going to be out of the receiving room either, which is why I don't think that you're going to have an expansive amount. Whereas I've seen some people, and I'll share the poll in a second, on Twitter, talk about maybe having 7 and one of these guys could get it if they have a stellar kick return, punt return option. But I think they drafted that. And I said this on this show a few times in the past few weeks. I think the returner is going to be living in the cornerback room, which is probably what the team wanted in Daquan Hardy. That's just my suspicion, given what they did. I don't know how differently you feel about that, but we can get to the kick return conversation in a little while. But yeah, I mean, again, excited to look at the back end of the room, excited to see the depth. I think that what I really like, and I'm going to make this final point too, and I'll ask if you agree with this, but I really like that the competition for the final wide receiver spot on this team is still a bunch of names that, like, you pick any one of them and I'll still call the depth of this room high quality. Like Chase Claypool fighting for a wide receiver 6 spot in the Bills roster, to me, is a good sign for how deep the room goes. And I know that there's conversations about the wide receiver room being lackluster, bottom of the league, but honestly, I know they don't have the alpha in Stephon Diggs anymore. I have said that I think that this room is a transitional room where it's not easy to compare it to last year because it feels apples and oranges, since this wide receiver room is based on a different offensive identity. And I feel that the floor of this room has elevated significantly, even if you don't have that alpha in Diggs, which is why when I'm talking about a wide receiver 6 still potentially being a viable option to be a veteran in this league or someone that could contribute to maybe a team that doesn't have as much depth, it's still exciting. It's something that I think this team did a good job of when it comes to the uncertainty we had. So what do you think about that? I mean, do you agree? Are you still kind of like on the room? Like, what are your thoughts about this in general?
Well, at the top end, it's not as good. We can agree. Like
Right.
no one on this roster right now is as good as Stephon Diggs. But the overall depth may be better, right? You talk about what the Bills had last year, with their top, we'll call it four guys, Diggs, Davis, Shakir, and Sherfield, right? We'll call it. Um, now you start talking about this room has 4 or 5 guys deep that could be legitimate contributors. You start thinking about what this means for Joe Brady in the sense of he now on him, it's not about like making your quote star receiver happy by feeding him targets. It's more about where do you deploy these guys on the field so that you're putting the combination of skill sets in the room. You've got pretty much everything covered, right? You've got route runners, you've got now a deep threat in MVS, you've got slot guys, you've got guys that can play out of the backfield. So you have high pointers and jump ball type guy like Keon Coleman now who can also do help you in the run game blocking. So you have like every skill set you'd want covered in the room.
Mm.
So I think for me now the attention then turns to Joe Brady and how he's going to
Yeah.
utilize these guys. So that's why for me the 6 wide receiver, I don't really care so much about it because we're already talking about 4 or so guys that, including Matt Collins and MVS, that's 5. Then you're talking about Dawson Knox and Kincaid. You're talking about James Cook out of the backfield. So it's like you're already talking about 6, 7, 8 guys that need to get targets on this roster. So I don't really care so much about that 6th guy who it is. May the best man win in camp. If it's Chase Claypool, great. If it's one of the other guys, great. I'm not so worked up about who that 6th wide receiver is going to be.
Yeah. And when I say I'm excited about it, I don't have unrealistic expectations about a wide receiver 6, what that would actually be in this room. That man is not getting 1,000 yards, not even getting 500. So I don't want it to be misconstrued as if I'm viewing it that way. I just meant it more so as it's cool to see that the depth of the room is still viable options. Someone that, God forbid, there is an injury, which that the luck of this team, that might be a reality. It's something that I can at least say I feel a little more comfortable with this year as opposed to years past, where maybe the top end of the receiving room goes down and the depth is just not enough to hold it for the rest of the year. Whereas if someone like a Hamler or a Claypool had to fill in for a game, I wouldn't be ecstatic about it. I wouldn't want to be in that situation, but I'd be a little more comfortable with that. So kind of where I was going with it, but yeah. And may the best man win. If a wide receiver 6 on this team ended up with 1,000 yards, oh God, because that probably would indicate a lot of things went wrong. But ultimately, we're going to find out very shortly who is the front runner for that room. And if it happens to be a Claypool, shorter shavers, I wish them all the best. Then whoever doesn't win it out, I wish you the best going forward, whether that's on the practice squad or elsewhere. And we're going to pivot to our next positional group. But I did want to pull up, like I said earlier, what was going on in the responses. And I'm going to start with Golden Mole Enthusiast. And I had to bring him up only just because of that one Bills video where they talked about the mole and it was basically a shit post. But this is another example of kind of how different it is from like other people's answers. You got one answer up here from Cliff, which is holding out hope for Ayuk. So I don't think that is going to happen, but I appreciate the sentiment surely. But even then, MVS, Coleman, Samuel, Shakir, Hollins, Claypool, another Claypool right up here. You go up here, though, Tim Glavin has Shakir, Samuel, Hollins, Coleman, Claypool, Hamler, and Shorter. So he has a different count. And then you have 7 here for an Ayuk trade. So we had a different mix of responses. 6 here, the final one being Shorter. They stashed him last year for a reason. I don't know about that sentiment, but I do think Shorter is a very underrated person to take that final spot. And then you got another 7 up here where you have from Jay Moore, Shakir, Samuel, Coleman, MVS, Hollins, Claypool should make the team. And then he elaborates with a few of these options at the end. They all need stellar camps, but basically the names that we have been going about on this episode. So thank you all so much for your contributions to this Twitter question. I appreciate everyone's engagement in that. I'll be sure to continue doing that and continuing to remember to put your answers up on the show. So with that being said, David, I loved your sentiment on this. Again, all fair takes and a lot of different skill sets with a lot of options for 6. But as much as things change, they also stay the same. I think special teams is the name of the game. And I think Sean McDermott would be smiling from ear to ear if he saw someone thriving on the special teams role and wanted to give him that final spot. So let's move on to O-line. O-line, again, it's another one of those depth position battles, but we did see some changes with Connor McGovern manning the center role after losing Mitch Morse. And now he is slated to be the starter. However, the Bills did take Cedric Van Pran, Hermione Granger in the draft this year. Pure center from Georgia, accomplished program, played pretty much all of his snaps in college at that position. And when you look at his frame, when you look at his size, athletic profile, it's not the most overwhelming, but we also kind of were used to a shorter arm, shorter hand guy with Mitch Morse playing that position for so many years. So kind of a similar, I don't want to say similar skill set because I don't know if that would be fair, but maybe just a similar frame. What are your thoughts on that draft pick, his likelihood to inherit the center role this offseason? And if not, what do you think they do with him?
Well, I would say the O-line in general, to me, it's going to be a question mark until they can prove this group together can prove they will play as well, hopefully as well as the group last year. The Bills were really fortunate last year, not just with the health of all the guys playing every game, the same group, but the level of play was really high and maybe the best offensive line play that Josh Allen's had in his time here with the Bills. And honestly, like, I don't think it's far-fetched to say that we could look back at the end of Josh Allen's career and say that 2023 offensive line start to finish was maybe the best that he ever had. I'm not saying that's going to be the case, but we could look back and say that. Connor McGovern moving over to center, it certainly sounds like there was some kind of handshake sort of behind the scenes agreement that he would take that job over from Mitch Morse once he left. I don't see SVGP as like the biggest threat to supplant Connor McGovern at center, at least for 2024. I think it would take an extremely impressive camp from SVGP to do that, and then you would slide Connor McGovern back over to left guard, bump David Edwards out of the starting left guard spot, which I'm not super thrilled about. I'm probably lower on that than a lot of people. I don't think we're talking about the O-line as much as we should be going into training camp. To me, it's probably my number one area of concern for this team going into camp, just because of how good the play was last year. And I don't know, David Edwards stepping in the left guard, McGovern moving into center, how that's really going to play out. I have confidence in McGovern, and I have confidence that the Bills have a good one in Van Pran Granger to be the backup center. I think he's going to be a lock to make the roster and probably will end up being the backup center for this team this year. But I don't see him supplanting Connor McGovern as the starter this year. Maybe in future years, but I don't think it's going to happen this year.
Yeah, I was way higher on the thought of him inheriting the center spot right after the draft. And maybe I was a prisoner of the moment in that, because I did think that when you take this kid who came from, again, an accomplished championship winning program, manned the center role for them for 3 years, did well in that spot, and then you take him really what I thought was at the position he was at because of the limited ability to play different positions at the NFL level. And again, maybe a little bit of worry about his frame. I was thinking that the center was there ready to go, honestly, that it wouldn't take much, but I think there is a lot more confidence in that room in Connor McGovern, mainly from Aaron Cromer, who, like you said, there was probably some behind the scenes agreement that when Morse is gone, that's your spot. Take it, run with it, show us what you got in camp. And yeah, I wasn't a big fan of making those changes. I wanted to keep Morse. I wanted to keep the line at it as it was. They were tremendously healthy last year, but they also were I would say the most put together unit they had for Josh Allen. So why change it? But obviously money was tight. They had to make some cuts, and this is the result of that. And what I'm hoping for is that pivot of McGovern to center and also sliding in Edwards at that guard spot isn't as big of a growing pain or transitional issue as it could potentially be, because the reality is Josh Allen playing under Mitch Morse since 2019 and being so used to that chemistry he has with him, even if it is McGovern just sliding over a position, it's still a big ask to get that rapport built up quickly in a season where there is uncertainty about how this offense will function, and depending on stability in your run blocking and pass pro to be effective, especially if you're trying to trot out maybe more play action or more disguising where you need to do deeper drops and go down the field on certain plays. So I wasn't a big fan of it in practice, but I think that tying it back to this conversation, SVPG might not have it ready yet, but I do think that there is the threat of him if he does well in camp. I don't even like a good camp for SVPG, I don't think is going to give him the spot. But what I do think it would allow the Bills to have is some peace of mind if the McGovern experiment doesn't work out the way they intended it to. Because if you have this player, a rookie, someone who has played the spot, showing that he's snapping the ball correctly, that he's able to get in his, get downfield if he needs to get downfield quickly, be a good anchor and pass pro, and you feel that McGovern might be struggling in actual game action, okay, slide him back to the position that he was playing all of last season, and let's just see what this kid has. Because if it was already going bad for McGovern, how much worse could it be? And it can always get worse, but I think in practice you would still have an option you would want to pivot to. So to keep it training camp specific, I'm focusing on just how he looks, if he looks pro ready at all, if he looks comfortable, because that could be good enough to at least secure him that spot and maybe the option to pivot to him if it's not working out. But other thoughts on this line, David? Like anything you still want to mention that we might not have covered?
I will say, I think in the minds of Bills fans, I think looking sort of into training camp and maybe beyond, I think the thought of having a Dawkins, McGovern, SVGP, Torrance, and Spencer Brown beyond 2024 offensive line for the future does sound quite appealing. If Van Pangranger does show well in camp and into the season, maybe he gets some reps. I don't know, because I'm not super sold on the depth we have at the interior right now. I wouldn't even mind seeing a guy like Alec Anderson push David Edwards for the left guard job if that is something. And so that's maybe a battle that, maybe it's not really a battle and it's really David Edwards, but I could see that being a battle in camp. I could see Alec Anderson maybe pushing David Edwards out of that starting left guard spot if they're really set on having McGovern be the center, which it sounds like they are. And if Alec Anderson outperforms David Edwards, it's not going to be of any stress to me to see David Edwards lose out on that job, because David Edwards is a run-of-the-mill left guard in the NFL. He is what he is. He does what he does, adequately, but he's not setting the world on fire as a starter in my mind. And so maybe Alec Anderson, a guy who was on the team last year, who's been in the program for a couple years now, can take that next step. Aaron Cromer's developed him very nicely, and maybe he pushes David Edwards out of that left guard spot, and then that conversation around center maybe becomes less of a conversation. So that's something I'm going to keep an eye on. Where is Alec Anderson in that sort of pecking order at the left guard position? And maybe it's not him, maybe it's someone else, but I want to see a little bit of competition at left guard.
Absolutely, yeah. Because they always say about David Edwards being a Cromer guy and that he was coaching him when they were on the Rams and he started in the Super Bowl, and that's all fine and dandy. But to me, if you have this younger player, or at the very least a player that's been on your roster for a few years, showing that out in camp, having a good camp, don't just give the position to Edwards just because you know the guy. You know what I mean? I want to make sure that if you are giving this position up, it's because it's well earned and deserved. And I'm not saying they're actually going to do that, but more in practice of, I'm familiar with Edwards. I've coached him before and we've been on a different team together, but I like what this kid brings to the table. I like the way he's shown out in camp. I think he works better in tandem with Deion Dawkins and Connor McGovern at center than maybe Edwards would. And maybe it would make more sense to remain Edwards as that rotational piece, where maybe sixth offensive lineman if you want to go for these jumbo sets, or maybe just rotate in the middle of games because someone needs a breather. To me, that was really a luxury that the Bills had, that not every luxury. Yeah. And not everything that once was a luxury means it's the viable option for the season to start. But I also have a lot of faith in Cromer as a coach. So to me, when the season starts, if he decides Edwards really is that guy to man that spot and he trusts him enough, I'll trust it too. But also, again, this is why I talked about with SVPG, if these depth players are having good camps, I think that just makes us feel a little bit better about the room as a whole, because we have to be honest too. Like I said before, it was a very healthy room and that was great. Do you think it's going to be that healthy again in 2024? Probably not. It's just not realistic. It's not realistic to get that level of health out of your offensive line for 17 games in a season, 2 years in a row. I would love it. I hope it happens, but I'm not hanging my hat on that. So at least let me see that guys like Anderson, or I already just all around the line now, but I know Van DeMar can do quite well in that spot. And maybe some of the younger guys, maybe if this kid Grable actually develops well in camp with his big frame, if these guys are capable of showing any sort of development under Cromer, then to me, I'm not going to be as pressed about the O-line, but I do think there are question marks surrounding it right now that should be answered quickly. And if they're not, or if we walk out of training camp still kind of saying, I wasn't crazy about the way Edwards looked in certain reps, and the depth wasn't really holding its own either on either side, and maybe getting pushed back in pass pro, then yeah, it would be a little bit more concerning week one, especially when, in the course of pretty much the first quarter and the middle of the season, you go up against some brutal pass rushes. So very fair points. Any final thoughts on O-line before we get to the defense and the position group that I think everyone is excited to hear about?
No, let's before I stress too much about this offensive line, let's move to defense.
We are a good vibe show. We are not a show meant to cause
Yes.
any stress or panic attacks. So I will not continue that conversation, but great points to be made, David. And before we get over to the safety room, which is where I want to take this next, these two handsome gentlemen on the other line would like to tell every one of you about the one pass. Their names are Aaron Quinn, Aaron Quinn, and Greg Thompson. Gentlemen, what do you got?
Many people ask us the best way to support us here at Cover One, and that is to sign up to become a Cover One Pass member. That contribution helps give us the access to all the data and information we use to create the content that you love.
And I think most importantly, brings you into our community of insiders. It's a great community based on Slack. I know a lot of people don't want to be on social media anymore or be in on those conversations. We bring all of it to you right in our great community of educated fans. And most importantly, you get access to our content creators.
Even better than that, everybody loves merch. You get awesome t-shirts, a cool decal, and a letter from the Cover One team signed directly to you.
All for $60. That gets you the entire season, next year's free agency and draft. $60. Click the link in the description. Cover One Insider. Become one today.
Thank you, Mr. Aaron Quigg. And yes, every one of you watching, that one pass, I cannot stress enough, is the lifeblood of the network. That allows us to have access to all of the resources that we use on a day-to-day basis, whether it is in our articles, whether it is in our shows, whether it is for general research for our content. It allows us to have access to all of these great resources that we could continue to compile information for you, the listener, the viewer, the reader. And for just 60 Crescent shards, you can access that link in the description below and sign yourself up for the One Pass. It is exciting times to be a One Pass member. We have made the migration to Discord. We are having a great time in all of those channels, and things are only going to continue to get more and more fun if you are a member. So I implore you all to please join if you have not already. And we thank you if you are contemplating it, have signed up, or will sign up. Thank you all so much. And if you could be as kind to drop a like on this video if you have not already, as we continue our discussion on that, is always greatly appreciated as well. And we are moving on to defense, and we are moving on to the safety room, a room that is probably the most uncertain, biggest question mark surrounding it on this team right now. And you go from the stability of Jordan Poyer, Micah Hyde tandem to, hey, are these guys going to be good? I don't know. Maybe, but let's find out. So, David, I mean, any thoughts you have about the battle? Who do you think is the front runner? I mean, really just how you're feeling about the room and anything you think is worth noting with it.
Well, I will say the Bills made a pretty early effort to get Taylor Rapp back in the mix. Obviously, there was uncertainty with this room. The Bills were at a point where it was time to turn the page, right, on Jordan Poyer and Micah Hyde. I'm not necessarily ruling out that Micah Hyde's going to come back at some point, but it was time to turn the page, right? I think mentally their games were there last year. They're mentally two of the best to ever do it, but I think there was some physical drop off in the play last year from both of those guys. So I think for the Bills, it was like, look, we had this luxury of this duo for so long. They will be revered. Every good thing comes to an end eventually. It's nothing against those guys, but it was time for some changes. And so bringing Rapp back early on, it was very interesting that they had only brought him in for a 1-year deal the year prior. So I think there was some kind of probably behind the scenes conversation there saying look, we're going to bring you back next year to kind of be that veteran leader. I think the Bills trust Taylor Rapp a lot. He played a lot last year, which I think is going to end up paying dividends for the Bills this year, and had his moments last year. He is what he is. He's definitely a little bit more comfortable down in the box area, but he did make that game sealing interception against the Dolphins in week 18, excuse me, in game 17. So that's one thing that was important for the Bills to get him back. Signing the veteran Edwards for 1 year, I think, was of necessity. The rest of the safety room, drafting Cole Bishop, DeMar Hamlin, you even throw Cam Lewis in that mix. There's a lot of guys that are good down and around the box. And so Mike Edwards, to me, on this 1 year contract is probably going to get a ton of snaps playing the deep half. Albeit we know the Bills do like to mix and match with their safeties a bit, as they did with Poyer and Hyde. And I do expect that to continue a little bit. I think guys like Rapp have shown that they can be adequate on the back end. I think Cole Bishop, while I do feel he is probably stronger at and around the line of scrimmage, I think his combine and his athleticism testing showed that he probably can do more than just that. Got all that experience in practicing against Kincaid, obviously, at Utah. And so I think all three of these guys are going to play a lot early on. If you're going to say, like, force me to name who the starting two guys are, if they're going to name two, it's probably going to be Edwards and Rapp week 1. But I think Cole Bishop's going to play very early on for this team. And I do think that the Bills will end up keeping 5 safeties, which includes Cam Lewis and DeMar Hamlin. That was my initial pre-camp projection. They kept 5 last year. I think they're going to keep 5 again, given that there's been turnover in this room. And I think they want to have some stability there. But I'm excited kind of about the changes in the room because it's a mix of like youth movement with Bishop, obviously the high draft pick. Rapp's still fairly young. Edwards is not an old guy by any means.
No.
And so it is a very nice mix, I think, of some youth with Bishop and some younger veterans in Rapp and Edwards. So I'm excited about this room. There maybe there'll be a drop off, maybe not, because I think we did already see a little bit of a drop off with Hyde and Poyer last year. So for me, it's more excitement than concern, I would say.
Right. So just to close up on the final point, or at least the point before your final point on that real quick. Yeah, I think Hamlin and Lewis probably stick around for special teams experience, and Lewis's versatility, I think, is valuable to keep around. And again, they're a hard hitting group. Taylor Rapp did have some bumps and bruises last year. So if he not decides, but if he winds up going down, which I think will happen at some point, then it's always good to have the depth there, especially guys that have played in the system for a few years. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if that's what they actually make the room look like and keep those guys. So I view it as, I wasn't happy to see Poyer and Hyde go, but I definitely understood it, especially Poyer, with how banged up he was. And then Micah Hyde with the fact that like one bad hit is life-changing for him, and we don't want to put him into that spot. Do I think he might still return? I'm not totally sold that he's done, only because it's been a long time, and I've seen the kind of trend with maybe vets just wanting to take time away, and if you need me and you have you have my number, convince me to come back. I don't want him to. I think it's best suited for him and his life going forward to not play football anymore. But it's a different beast when you're a competitor and you're someone that's been around it for so long and might miss it very, very much, to a point where you're leaving your options open. But all this to say, I think it was time to move on. I was okay if they brought him back on a 1-year deal. They didn't. I'm not heartbroken about it. To me, that was a signal of change, akin to some of the other decisions they made on the defense this year, really around the whole team. So I was comfortable with that. But what I will say is, when I look at the room and the way it's constructed now, I do think that Rapp is going to end up being the starter again for the contract that he was given and the love that they tend to have for him, the hard-hitting, very physical style, the ability. He started out rough, but it felt like as the year got on, his coverage and communication got a little bit better. And maybe now that he gets that starting deep half role, he's someone that might thrive from actually being able to full send into being a starter versus just being a rotational piece, and maybe having a little more comfort with more snaps being played. But I've been of the mindset that I think Bishop starts week 1, and I've been kind of growing on this thought. And my reasoning for it is, I personally don't think that the coaching staff has any sort of hierarchy in the safety room right now. I don't think it exists. I think it is everybody starting at the same playing field, because you drafted Cole Bishop in the 2nd round. You know what his athletic profile is, and you know how hard of a hitter he is, how good he is at recognizing, run fitting, shooting gaps, all of these things. And you think that this guy has a very high ceiling and will eventually be a starter. And there's concern about McDermott and his rookies, which I think is complete unfound nonsense. I think he starts plenty of rookies and young players. I think if Cole Bishop comes into camp and shows even just a good level of understanding of his assignments, where he's got to be, good communication, making plays early, he's a starter to me. And I think he is the perfect fill-in for Poyer's role, at least for last year, to start, with the room to continue to expand his role as the season goes on, as he gets more comfortable in this defense. And with Mike Edwards, again, it would be understandable if he gets that starting role, but it's a 1-year contract, and I just feel like it makes more sense for him to be that rotational kind of Swiss Army man that you line up, closer to the line, or maybe deeper on the field, or maybe if you run any dime, then have him rotate in for a few packages. But I don't think it's unlikely for Cole Bishop to be a week 1 starter. In fact, a lot of people have said it's kind of like the Milano Humber situation. I don't think so. I think if this kid has any flashes out the gate, he's starting. And I mean, we've seen situations of other members of this team, like, younger players that needed to earn their stripes and show that they needed to be comfortable before they could get any sort of starting presence, like Kaiir Elam, who comes out of the gate a bit bumpy, doesn't look very polished, still very handsy, still very out of place, getting beat. So he's not ready. So it's not that I think they're just going to trot him out because he's a high pick or anything like that, because they've shown that high picks don't automatically get the spot. But if he is showing any positive flashes, I think they'd be remiss to not have him be a starter. So I'm a bit more optimistic that he will be a week 1 starter. And I think your starting group will be, or your starting duo will be Rapp, Bishop, with Edwards as a rotational piece, and your back end being Hamlin and Lewis. So any other thoughts?
I would love to see Bishop as a week 1 starter. I'm a big fan of his. He was on my, early on in the process, he was one of my kind of favorites. He was my no matter what safety this year on our no matter what show. So like, I was a big fan of his. And then to me, the combine just solidified everything I was seeing and watching his games, especially athletically. So I'm a big Cole Bishop fan. I hope he does win the job. But, it's hard to say before camp that he will. I hope he does. And I hope he has a great camp and he does win the job. So I'll leave it at that, I guess.
Yeah. I wish it started on Tuesday and not Wednesday, and that the show was after the first day. But no, it's all speculation for right now. But again, it wouldn't shock me at all if they ended up going with the 2 vets. I watched Brandon Beane pump his fist in pure excitement and joy when he found out that they were taking Bishop and the Texans didn't take him. I'm also kind of convinced that if Bullard fell, they were going to take him too. I know he was
my favorite. He was my favorite.
I had to bring him up because I knew you loved him, and I'm firmly convinced, because the Packers picked only a few picks before the Bills, I think, in the second round. It was 2 picks before?
I think
so, my goodness. Yeah, dude. If Bullard fell, I think he's there. I think they take him 100%. But we got Bishop. He's an athletically gifted player. He's been spoken very highly of by Dalton Kincaid. Naturally, they were teammates, and Dalton was probably also pushing some buttons to get him on the Bills. This is a guy that I think it's not going to take much for him to end up being a starter on this team, and I'm rooting for him too, but I'm rooting for everybody. Good vibes all around. And let's move on now. So I wanted to talk about cornerback with you, and we know at least Rasul Douglas and Christian Benford seem to be taking shape as your ones right now. Like, I don't think Benford has a good camp. It's a lock pretty much. But I want to talk to you a little bit more about Kaiir Elam. And I have said in shows past, I did a show with Uber a few weeks ago, actually, and we talked about the most underrated components that we think will benefit the Bills in 2024. And one of mine was Kaiir Elam's development, specifically for the fact that the implications of a positive or negative, I guess if you'll call it progression or regression at camp, have very big implications to the depth of this boundary corner room, where if he has a good camp, you can feel a bit more confident of him as a rotational boundary corner. But if he has those same lapses and there's no progress and he's just not getting it in any way, despite the coaching changes, I don't have a lot of faith in this boundary corner room. So I want to ask you your opinions of him going into camp, as well as the boundary corner room itself, because Taron Johnson is your slot corner. That's a position you have. You can talk about nickel if you want, but really just that boundary room.
Yeah, the boundary room, I thought it was a little surprising that the Bills didn't give Douglas like a 1 or 2 year extension off of this sort of last year of his deal. Benford's clearly going to be locked in as a starter based on his play. I don't think there's a question of that. And I think the fact is Douglas they're going to try to squeeze everything they can out of this last year out of him, presuming they do give him an extension at some point, given his age 30, I believe, season. To me, the concerns around Elam's development, he's, said the right things. The coaches have said the right things, but we've heard this in the past with other players that have said the right things, and then it just didn't translate onto the field, right? This is not the first time we've been down this road with a highly drafted player or a talented player or a guy we hoped would develop more. So to me, this is, look, we don't have that. I'll call it a luxury of a Dane Jackson as a fourth corner anymore, right? Like you don't have that in the room anymore. So it's going to be a guy like Jamarcus Ingram probably as your fourth boundary guy. And to me, this is more of a concern for beyond 2024, right? Because in the scenario where Rasul Douglas is not back with the team after this year, and as of right now, he won't be, you are putting yourself in a position in 2025 if Kaiir Elam doesn't show that he can maybe step into a starter's role in 2025 through his play this year in 2024, the Bills are going to be really hurting at boundary corner, I think, beyond 2024. So I think for 2024, it's important for Kaiir Elam in his trajectory, whether up or down in the future of his NFL career, whether that's with the Bills or otherwise, potentially as a starter for the Bills in 2025, depending on how things go. But also in the case of if there's injury this year, we saw him come in and play okay and get that interception in the Steelers playoff game. Great. He's had the flashes, right? It's the consistency we need to see. This is what I'm going to say about Kaiir Elam's camp. I don't want to be in a situation where one day I hear from the beat guys that he had a great day and the next day he was just absolutely abysmal. We want to see some consistency. I'd rather him be solidly doing well each day. And yes, obviously you want him to flash and make a few big plays, but I think that it's more important for consistency. Now we see the consistency from him now that he is technically a veteran, right? Going into his third year. Then we hear about the big ups and downs. Like we want to get rid of some of those, some of that variance with his play. And so that's the thing I'm going to be following from the reports from camp on with him.
I love that you mentioned that. And I also love that you mentioned Rasul Douglas not getting a longer contract, because I think at least right now the plan has been that if Elam takes that step forward, that is our guy. That is our starting boundary corner opposite Benford next year. We can feel more comfortable and confident in that room. We can lock them both down maybe 2 extensions because we are approaching that time with them. And we can feel confident about this room because we have 2 very young corners that can play both zone and man, excel with some really good physical tools, and have been very reliable for us. But with Elam, the variance has been the problem. That Steelers game was about 3 straight plays of my Twitter timeline saying, oh my God, get him off the field. This is awful, because Pat Freiermuth pushed him like 10 yards down the field. Then he gets the ugliest penalty on Deontay Johnson, and then an interception in the end zone. And everyone's like, oh, okay, that's great. Thanks, man. Never do that again. Not the interception part, just everything prior. And that has been the name of the game for Kaiir Elam for the past couple of years. I mean, his rookie season, he comes in, he has his hiccups, whatever, but then he makes that really great red zone interception against Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. The Miami game, he gets a pick, and he also makes a very crucial game-sealing play. I don't think it's impossible at all for Kaiir Elam to have a camp and be successful and show flashes, but a more consistent day-to-day basis of feeling more comfortable, feeling more confident, making plays on the ball, coaches favoring his skill set and being able to get the most out of the traits he presents to the defense. Because if you get that out of him, again, it quells so many of my concerns with boundary corner. It makes me feel so much better about him rotating in, because I'll say this, Jamarcus Ingram has also shown some pretty good play when he's been called upon in the limited times he has. And granted, that's as a depth corner, right? Like, I'm not expecting him to play as well as Rasul Douglas or Christian Benford. But when you're talking about the back end of this room, it's not so much that you just have to hope that Elam can pan out because you lost Trey White and now your starters, you need some immediate depth. You also lost Dane Jackson, and that void needs to be filled as well. And if Jamarcus Ingram shows just stability in camp as well, paired with a potential Elam progression in his development, I think this goes from being a question mark to one of the top boundary corner rooms as far as depth goes in the NFL potentially. So it really is just so imperative that he has a good camp. And I am praying that that's the case and that we don't see reports of Elam on the second team to start and only going down from there with no flashes in the ones. Just let's see it. He's still a young guy. He was a project. We all know he was a project. Let's see that project finally come into fruition this year, and let's get some stable CB play, not QB play. But
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, and you think about going into camp last year, it was Trey White, it was Benford, it was Elam and Dane Jackson. Like you felt pretty good about
yeah,
those four guys. Now you feel pretty good about two guys and not so sure about the guys behind it. I will say though, I think, we were hopeful that Trey White was going to return to form starting last year, and we were pretty confident that Christian Benford was going to continue the solid play he built off his rookie season. I do think Rasul Douglas and Benford could have a higher ceiling than White and Benford from a year ago, or at least the same, but it's the depth, right, that concerns you. And like we've been for multiple drafts, it seems like we were talking about like the Bills need a corner and the Bills need a corner. And like they finally drafted Elam, but it doesn't feel right now like it was the right one. So I'm rooting for him. He seems like a really great like dude in the locker room, and it seems like he really does try to work hard. I don't know that the Bills did him any favors and kind of put him into a system that maybe he wasn't going to be comfortable with
right.
initially, although maybe the Bills felt like they needed that skill set. So there's a little bit of this on the Bills as well. But at the end of the day, if Elam can show some improvement this year, I think that would make a lot of fans more at ease.
Yeah, and we know that Brandon Beane likes his traits, and he likes seeing athleticism, and he likes freaks. Like we saw it with Gregory Rousseau, where he takes a 6'6" DN with insane measurables, but he doesn't really have much experience at his position and was going to be a major development. I mean, what else can you say about Josh Allen, who went through the same curve? So it's not surprising that they wanted to bank on the traits panning out with Kaiir Elam. But again, it's pulling a fish out of water. Like you had him playing in a very specific scheme at Florida. Now you're asking him to play more disciplined zone heavy defense in Buffalo, where it's just worlds apart from what you were used to doing. And also, I mean, I don't know what went on behind the scenes with John Butler. I'm not sure what ended up happening with that, but it seems like it wasn't a good match with these two guys, maybe a clash of ideologies. And it really ended up paired with also some of the injuries he went through, just not panning out for him for the first couple of years. So I'm also wondering if the addition of Coach Adai from Miami helps Elam a bit more, because you have a coach that is on the younger side, as also just freshly worked with college players coming from a man heavy system that might be able to see what Elam is doing and be able to refine his traits a little bit more as you ask for more of him this year. And also the hope that he could stay healthy. So really a big year for Kaiir Elam, and Elam's development curve is a huge factor when you discuss the good or bad depth of the Buffalo Bills boundary corner room. But David, any final thoughts on cornerback in general? Anything else you want to mention? Any people that we might be sleeping on? Anything
I'll just say one last bit on Elam, right? I think last year there was an immense amount of pressure on him to be the CB2, right? Opposite of Trey White. There was a lot of talk of that going into camp, and ended up being Christian Benford. And like maybe that was a hit to his ego or so. I don't know, right? We won't ever know. There was a lot of pressure on him when he was drafted because the Bills had that glaring need at corner. You can take the side that it's a very important year. It could be a make or break year for him, which it may well be. But you could also maybe see the perspective that there's less pressure on him this year because there isn't the expectation that he's going to come in and be one of the starters. So maybe that works in his favor. He thrives in a situation maybe where there's a little bit less pressure on him, and that's what really maybe spurs his development. So I could see both sides of that perspective, but I guess on the corner room, and as we kind of transition maybe into the last bit here, at the nickel with Daquan Hardy, you mentioned early on in the show around the return game. Um, I think I think the Bills want him to be the punt returner. I don't know that he's going to be the kick returner. I think that's still going to be Ty Johnson, at least to start out, and the Bills will have a different. I think the Bills will have a different kick returner than punt returner. Daquan only had 3 kick returns in his college career. Granted, they were all, I think, in his last season, but he is definitely primarily a punt return guy. And we saw Ty Johnson do decently well when he wasn't bringing the ball out from 8 yards deep last year. That frustrated the hell out of me a few times. But I think the new kickoff rules, the Bills maybe didn't do enough with trying to find a more dynamic kick returner. I think
I agree with that.
at
Yeah.
I think at punt returner, they want it to be Hardy. I think in a pinch, it could be Shakir because again, like where is Shakir going to fall in the pecking order in terms of targets on the offense? If he's fourth, maybe he's fourth guy on the rung, the Bills would be okay putting him, back there as a punt returner. So to me, the biggest question mark is at kick returner. Do you have a dynamic enough player back there with the new rules? Not so worried about punt returner because punt returns are kind of still not a huge factor in today's game as
Mhm.
much as they used to be. But now with the new rules, kick returning can be. I think it's going to be Ty Johnson to start. But I don't know who the competition is there right now, and that's the
Yeah.
thing I'm struggling with and struggling where I maybe don't know that the Bills did enough to address that, but also I think maybe they just couldn't, right? They just couldn't because of the situation they were in. So I think it'll be by default Ty Johnson to start with, but maybe there's some battle there potentially with someone else. I just don't know who it will be.
And I think being able to have so much or flexibility to be able to focus on punt returner being as dynamic as it could possibly be is a bit of a luxury that, like you said, they weren't really in a position to go full send on it. So, yeah, I think Hardy kick returning is probably the most likely outcome. And I think Ty Johnson, just for the fact that, again, he was able to do it, I'm sorry. Yeah. No, wait, kick returning. I got my wires crossed tonight. I don't know what's going on with my brain tonight, David. I apologize. But what I will say about this is I would prefer it to remain that duo and not touch the receiving core at all either.
Yeah.
I don't want Khalil Shakir returning anything. Like,
I mean, I
already
don't want him to either, but I mean,
yeah.
if they're in a pinch and Hardy doesn't
Right.
doesn't
It was like
show
kind
it,
of
then
yeah. If he doesn't show it, they're going to turn to him or maybe even sign if there's anyone even out there still that is capable of doing so. Just any person off the street that they feel could be comfortable. But I think when it comes to the receiving core and the return game, like they're already thin enough and not thin enough because I like their depth, but I mean it more so like if they lose any one of these guys, I think it is going to be a bit frustrating. And it's something that I would rather them turn to if they absolutely had to. Kind of how I felt with like Micah Hyde a few years ago. Like I didn't like seeing him do it in any capacity. Never. But when they had to, it's kind of just like, all right, sure, fine. Like, I get it. And, he had a couple of really exceptional plays, especially the special teams pirouette against Miami or the almost return against New England. So it's not like it ever went south, but I think keep him out of harm's way and go with one of these two options. I think that's really the whole reason that they got Hardy. I also think they got him to be that backup nickel spot too. So you get that as a plus. But ultimately, if this guy could just show anything good in camp, I'd be happy with it. But if not, yeah, I mean, if you don't want to tap into your receiving core, I hope that you can go into free agency or find any semblance of anyone from maybe your undrafted free agent room. Like, I mean, damn, I don't even know if anyone in that room is really capable of taking that role either, or anyone could be molded to it. So let's just hope that these guys stay healthy and have a good camp. But you really bring up that point about them not doing enough. And I do agree. I think it's not that they didn't have anybody in position, but ultimately, and it is, again, a byproduct of the team not really having the flexibility to do it. It does feel like the room is a bit bare. And when you talk about the pivots in how special teams are changing this year and maybe the opportunity for different types of skill sets to be more prominent and maybe even bigger guys end up becoming more viable return options if you're talking about dudes that are just really hard to bring down once they have any semblance of speed behind them. Like, yeah, it feels like if you're asking either one of these guys to have a lot of success in that realm, I don't know if they will, but there are options to start. And if you do feel comfortable enough with Shakir getting that spot, so be it. I just hope it works out and no injuries happen. I'll knock on some wood. And really, yeah, I mean, it's not a room that I want to focus too much on in any sort of negative way, but I would like to at least know that Hardy is looking okay in camp so I could feel a bit more comfortable about him manning that spot. So I don't really have too much else to say about it. Anything else you want to add to the return room before we wrap up?
Well, I'll just say I'm on the topic of special teams, right? The punter situation is interesting because Tyler Bass seems like his head is up his ass or something. I don't know, right? Like there's something going on. He's battling some demons right now, it certainly seems. And so the yips or whatever, he seemed to be kicking better in OTAs with Browning holding. I don't know why the Bills decided that they were going to keep Sam Martin. wasn't a good holder to begin with,
No.
and that's in punting he was quite inconsistent. So I don't know, man. This whole dynamic between what the Bills are going to get out of their punter, what it means from a holding standpoint with Tyler Bass, like this special teams for the Bills is, I mean, there's question marks for me on this special teams unit going into the season. Like long snapper is your most secure position, I would say. But
Yeah.
Bass needs to bounce back this year because they have a big contract with him, and he needs to find it this year, man.
I don't want to be worried about Tyler Bass, but it's very hard to not be after really him. I know it's a team game, but missing that field goal against Kansas City and also just getting a case of the yips. And I do think that Sam Martin did have a lot to do with that, but like, is it going to get any better with the undrafted free agent? I don't know. I don't know if that's a road you want to go down or if you'd rather have the vet to man that punting spot. But this is also a massive year for Tyler Bass and a massive year for the special teams. And I see a few people in our chat talking about Coach Smiley. And really, yeah, I mean, I was kind of surprised the Bills retained him after this past season. I know there were some flashes, but over the past few years, it's been kind of shoddy, inconsistent, downright bad at times. And I just wonder if there's an optimism in that building, maybe with some of the rule changes, that it might cater to him a little bit better. Maybe he puts these players in a better position to succeed. Maybe they just want to see if he can do it. But I really do worry about special teams as a whole. I think it honestly is one of the weaker parts of the team. And when you look at Tyler Bass, if those struggles continue, man, like again, I'm very optimistic about this offense, and I'm very optimistic about being able to move the ball down the field and the dynamics and being able to score. But what are going to happen in those games where we need you to get that 3 in harsh conditions? What is going to happen in those games where it's windy and you got to nail this 43-yarder? Like, can I have any faith in you? And also, again, if Sam Martin's the guy still, like, is the holding going to ever improve? I don't know if it will at this stage of his career. So we kind of sit here in this holding pattern of, that seems to be the one part of this team that I don't know about the actual non-kicking units, but punting, kicking, like, it's a concern. It's one that I don't want to end this show on a bad note, but one that I really do think this team has to get figured out and has to get figured out by the regular season. And if you're seeing Bass miss gimmies in training camp, I mean, how does that improve during the regular season? Like, what would have to change? And I just don't know if that solution is something that can be solved this season, or if you just have to bear with it, suffer through it, patchwork it as best as you can until next season comes around. And maybe with the many draft picks you have, you could start looking to address that then. So sorry, guys, that's a sour note to end this thing on, but it's
not, because camp starts tomorrow and we're happy about that.
We're very happy about that. I feel like I need a beer, but we're very happy about that. But David, I'm very appreciative of your time, for you being on the show. I want to ask you one final question before we sign off and we turn it over to Mr. Anthony Prohaska and the disguised coverage, not the disguised coverage. Well, I guess because it's the only one I know with that name. But your final thoughts, final storylines, anything you think we haven't touched upon in this episode that you feel needs to be having a little bit more, I guess you'd call it just more frequency and conversation, something we can focus on a little bit more.
I mean, I want to hear that Von Miller's beating dudes like in camp this year. Like, we didn't really talk about edge, but I think like in 3 different facets, the Bills did the thing with Von Miller's contract. They re-signed AJ Epinesa and they exercised the 5th year on Rousseau. So clearly those are the 3 guys they are trusting. And I think even if his physical skills have diminished, Javon Solomon needs to get under Von Miller's wing. And I'm hoping that Bills can squeeze some juice out of him. I said this on air raid last night. So that edge room, to me, paying attention pretty big to that as well. I want to hear that Von Miller is beating dudes, even if he's beating Spencer Brown, right? That's fine. Like, I want to hear that that's happening. So yeah, I think we need to look at that D-line too. And I'm super excited to see Dwayne Carter in action as well. Duke right down the road from me here.
Right on. Yes, I am a huge Dwayne Carter fan. I don't know if they told you the story of how I reacted in the Radio Row when we picked him. Yeah, I was freaking the hell out, dude. It was pretty obnoxious, but it was so worth it because I'm pumped to have him on this team. And also just little listen, that Xavier Worthy trade is going to be tied to the Bills whether they like it or not, and it's going to happen. But we also should take power in this situation and understand that we also got this D tackle with a lot of promise and a high ceiling in the NFL, that if this guy pans out and looks really good, don't say that we let the Chiefs get Xavier Worthy. Say that the Bills got Dwayne Carter. They let the Bills have Dwayne Carter. Let's take power in that situation and also accept that both of these wide receivers will probably just end up being good and we shouldn't tether any narratives to each team. But yeah, Von Miller, I don't know what the hell to expect from Von Miller this year. I've talked about maybe getting him back to 75%, and is that good enough? But when you talk about him rotating in, because I do think that Rousseau and Epineza are going to be your starters, then I think just having him on a limited, even at limited capacity, where maybe it's 75%, 80% of what Von Miller once was, can still be effective, can definitely still be better than last year. And also, I'm looking forward to watching some of the depth players outside of Dwayne Carter, but like Austin Johnson, Duan Smoot, Javon Solomon, like guys that really can heighten the floor of the D line to being a unit that, even if it does still not really have the super high caliber edge rush presence, still will be effective, could still generate pressure, could still cater with those linebackers that you have right behind them, and still be a unit that would be the strength of the defense. Because I will say, I think that the front seven of the Buffalo Bills will be the strength, assuming they can all stay healthy and on the field. So that's where I'll leave it. A little more positive now. But David, again, thank you so much. Very much appreciate your time. Great insight as always, like you do on your show. It's always a pleasure to have you here. Tell the good people what you got going on, where they can find you, and anything you want to say before we sign off.
Yeah, I mean, most of these people in the comments section, I recognize the names. They're all watching the Air Raid Hour on Monday nights at 9. We had been doing our sort of live Monday nights at 9 and pre-recorded Thursdays. We're stopping that during training camp, obviously, because it doesn't make sense to pre-record for when days of camp are happening. So we're going back to our normal, just Mondays at 9, our slightly extended shows. We're going to have Alex Brasky from Batavia on Mondays now on the beat, going to be kind of boots on the ground reporting, coming in and join us for like 15, 20 minutes each Monday through training camp. And then when the regular season starts, as I think mostly everyone here knows, we'll be doing our Air Raid Hour pregame shows before every game on game days, and then in our normal Monday 9 p.m. slots for our post-game reactions on the Air Raid Hour proper. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it, man. Football starting. This is like the official beginning of the 2024 season.
This to me is the start of the league year. Forget all those other things that happened. This is when it gets serious. And now we're ending on some good vibes. But yes, guys, I know a lot of people in here have checked their show out, but if you are someone that somehow has not been fortunate enough to watch Air Raid Hour, please do that. It's a great show. David and Judge do exceptional work and provide very interesting content whenever they go live. It's a really fun, engaging show too, and some great takes. As you could tell, I had it up earlier. I actually blocked it out, but I had to pay homage again to Judge by going with the Joj Mathis headline, and I hope he saw it. And if he didn't, I'll be sure to let him know that I did that tonight. But yes, everybody, check their show out Monday nights. And also Alex Brasky, who I've had on this show a few times, is a great guest to be getting. And someone who, again, boots on the ground, is going to be there providing really up close and personal insight with everything he sees. A great resource to have to keep you up to date on, hopefully only good news that happens. But definitely check it out. And for me, again, my name is Joe DeRosa. You can find me on Twitter /X at @show_DeRosa. I am here every Tuesday night, and I will be back again in a week to continue on with our discussion about training camp and any updates we have. I apologize for the smooth brain I had tonight. I don't know why I was stuttering so much, but sometimes I just have an off night, and that unfortunately had to happen tonight with you on the air, David. So thank you for bearing with me. But we will be back next week. So I hope you guys are excited. Get a good night's sleep. Get up. Feel pumped up. Feel refreshed, because tomorrow training camp officially begins. Everything is starting. We are going to learn so much about this team over the next few weeks. Football is here, folks. So I hope you're as excited as we are, because we are about to have a blast. But that is tomorrow. For tonight, we say farewell. Have a great night. Stay safe. And as always, go Bills. Thank you so much for being here. We'll see you soon.